Welcome to Fortune Forecast. I am Daisy, your hostess, and you're in my book playlist. We started on the book titled The Psychic Life of Jesus. It was written by Reverend G. Maurice Elliott and published by the Spiritualist Press. If you're new to my channel and just found us at this video and would like to catch up on the previous chapters, please visit my book playlist and grab the previous chapters from there. If you're ready to get started, you can go to my description and click on the timestamp and you can jump right to that. Or if you'd like to stay here for a minute as I share my narrator's comments. I like the different perspective that the author is providing in the way that he is showing light on Jesus. And also I appreciate the different contexts in which words have a meaning as then and now. For example, when I was going to elementary school, the word gay back then literally meant joyous and happy. And then slowly it took on a whole different meaning, that as it referred to being predisposed to the same sex. I bring this up because so far the author has shared some of the miracles that Jesus performed in casting out Satan. And he stated that Jesus regarded disease as due to satanic agency. And hence, when he was healing the sick, literally what he was doing is rebuking the spirit of infirmity and seeing the person as whole and healthy and accepting as that pristine health as the true form of the person. Another thing that I thought was very interesting was how Jesus believed that people are healed by their faith. And when the apostles or the person wasn't healed, he would ascribe it to that fact that the person or the apostle was not having faith in the healing process. And in these past chapters, he also touched upon remote healing, as he called it, distance healing, that Jesus was doing a healing even when the person was 20 miles away. And as Jesus himself said, "You will do greater things than I." We have so many authors that have written about healing. Mary Baker Eddy is one of them. And also, if you've heard of the scientist and author Greg Braden from Zero Point, he also talks about the healing power of prayer and remote healing. He talks about the science behind that. As for myself, I have had a couple near-death experiences which have given me a different appreciation of this existence that I have and a better understanding of what this author means when he says that faith, love, hope transmit psychic powers. I can accept that. And I will tell you this, I have no more psychic powers than you. So having said that, let us now move on to our next chapter. The news that Jesus had cast out an unclean spirit from a man in the synagogue and had healed Peter's wife's mother spread like wildfire. The same day, and even ere the sun did set, the people crowded about Peter's house where Jesus was staying. The whole city was gathered at the door. They brought their sick and diseased and those possessed with unclean spirits. Jesus came out and healed every one of them, and at his command the unclean spirits were cast out. The enormous expenditure of psychic power which this day's work had entailed caused Jesus to seek solitude. So early next morning, he left Peter's house for a quiet place in the hills where he could be alone. No medium, however gifted, not even Jesus, can give out without taking in. He needed to be recharged with psychic and spiritual power, and we are not surprised to read that Peter found him deep in prayer. He was praying, not saying prayers, When he refreshed and reinvigorated in body and soul, Jesus started on a preaching and healing tour throughout the cities of Galilee. In one of the cities, a man full of leprosy came to him and said, "If you will, you can make me clean." Jesus laid his hand upon him, saying, "Of course, I will. Be clean." And the leprosy vanished. This was not a miracle. It was a demonstration of the wonder-working power of faith. Faith, not mere creedal belief, is one of the most powerful forces in the world. It does not work miracles, but it does bring into play supernormal powers. And the greater the object of faith, the greater the result. This leper would never have said to Jesus, "If you will, you can," unless he had already heard of the signs and wonders which Jesus had performed. The man's faith was great. It was not, however, strong enough to heal him. So Jesus did not say, "Thy faith hath healed thee." But he knew that the man's faith was strong enough to enable him to receive the healing power which his touch could impart. Jesus therefore touched him, and he was healed of the foul disease. Does anything like that happen today? It does. But it is very surprising that it does. For, as we know, Jesus could not exercise his psychic power where there was unbelief. And we today are literally surrounded by unbelief. The unorthodox church does not believe, and the outside world does not believe. Yet, in spite of this barrier of negative and adverse influence, the faith of spiritualists and other heretics is so great that signs and wonders are being performed by them. Dr. Lindsay Johnson writes to me, "I know of a woman who had cancer. This was proved by the nest of cells seen in the microscopic sections taken from the growth. It was testified by 12 surgeons of repute, and the cancer was healed in a moment, solely by faith. Faith released the healing, psychic powers within. A young farmer came to see me because he was on the verge of committing suicide. He was a victim of chronic eczema, which inflamed and irritated his whole body. Harley Street specialists could not heal him. Sleep was impossible. He was nearly out of his mind. It so happened, which really means that the spirit guides had so arranged, that a powerful medium was to visit us on the following day, to exercise his psychic powers in the presence of a powerful healing circle at the vicarage. So I asked the young farmer to come to the circle, and I put to him the question: if Jesus were staying here at the vicarage, you would, at once, go to him with a certain conviction that he could and would heal you, would you not? Yes, of course, was his reply. I then told him that Jesus had assured his followers that they would receive power to do the works that he did and greater. And I urged him to have faith. He came to the circle, and the medium's guide immediately informed us that the healing power emanating from the members of the healing circle was so great, and the faith of the young farmer so strong, that he was already healed. 2 days later, he came to the vicarage and showed me that his body was completely free from any trace of the disease, his flesh being that of the healthiest of men. Can lepers be healed today? There's no reason to doubt that they can be healed, but so far as I know, no attempt has ever been made to heal them in the way in which the young farmer was healed. When has any leper been brought into a powerful healing circle with a powerful healing medium presiding? Has any attempt been made to bring psycho-spiritual healing to the leprous? No one can say what can or cannot be done until these means have been tried. Mr. Stanley DeBrath remarks in his Psychic Philosophy, "Nothing is more striking than the helplessness of physiology when confronted with physical problems, and men of science being, like the theologians, simply men with a special training and bias, are frequently as contemptuous of all that will not square with their theories as divines are. And that is the trouble. It is because of this bias that they will not allow that sickness and disease can be healed by psychic means. I knew a young woman who was turned out of no less than 5 hospitals as incurable. She was in the last stage of consumption, and her long wasting illness had reduced her body to a mere shadow weighing only 4.5 stones. The doctor said that she could not live until the morning. But her faith was of the wonder-working kind referred to by Paul in 1 Corinthians, verse 12. And that evening a spirit light appeared at her bedside, and in the midst of it stood a spirit messenger who said, "Your sufferings are over. Get up and walk." She at once did so, and partook of a thoroughly good meat supper, though she had not tasted solid food for 6 months. Next morning, she was plump and well and smiling. The doctor declared that during the night she had gained 2 stones in weight. Her blood was tested, and not a trace of the disease remained, and an X-ray examination revealed that the old lungs which had wasted away were now replaced by new lungs. I am purposely giving these cases of healing in order to show that what is being done today by psycho-spiritual means is quite as remarkable as anything that Jesus did by the same means. It is only natural that it should be so, for he knew that his followers would do the works that he did, and greater. He said so. After his preaching and healing tour through Galilee, Jesus returned to Capernaum, and a Roman captain, who had evidently heard that Jesus had previously healed a nobleman's son in that city, came and besought him to heal his favorite slave. Jesus at once went towards the captain's house. But the captain, knowing the Jewish prejudice against entering in with a Gentile, said to him, "Do not trouble to come to the house. I am not worthy to have such a guest. Speak the word only, and my slave will be well." Jesus was delighted with the man's faith and said, "Your faith has made possible the answer to your prayer. Go home, and you will see that it is so." And the slave was healed at that very hour. It would certainly seem that the intense faith of the captain had its influence upon the subconscious mind of his favorite slave. Shall we say that the fervent faith of the man released the healing power of the God within him, enabling him to transmit, albeit unconsciously, healing power to his favorite slave with whom he was en rapport? Jesus never claimed that his own healing power was due to his status on the second person of the Trinity. He never claimed that his power was confirmed to the divinity of his person. He claimed it for himself only because he had perfect faith in God. The Son can do nothing of himself. And what he claimed for himself, he claimed for others. Indeed, for his faithful followers, he foretold greater works than those he did himself. Had the captain's faith been weak, Jesus would have visited the slave and laid his hand upon him. But the captain's faith had, as I believe, rendered this unnecessary. Why did Jesus lay such a stress on faith? Surely one reason was that he wanted all his followers to be able to do what he was doing, and he knew that nothing develops a man's psychic powers more quickly than does faith, which creates that subliminal receptivity without which non-material forces cannot act on the body. He, the master healer, could do no mighty works where there was unbelief. End of chapter. If you haven't done so, may I ask, could you please hit that like button and help me out here with the YouTube algorithm? That's so kind. Thank you so much. Let's stay right here as I swing over now to chapter 6. In this book, we are concerned with the psychic element in the life of Jesus as narrated in the Gospels. We are not concerned with the historicity of the narratives. We're taking them as they stand. One day, when Jesus was teaching on the shore of the lake, the crowd of listeners was so great that he got into one of the boats belonging to Peter and John. He wanted the boat as a pulpit, so he asked Peter to row him out a little from the shore. And when the teaching was over, he said to Peter, "Now push out into deep water and let down your nets and fish." Peter answered, "Captain," he used the sailor's word half playfully, "we do our fishing at night, not in the daytime when the glare is on the lake. All last night we fished and caught nothing, but as it is you who have asked me to let down the nets, I will certainly do so." Then, to his amazement, the nets were soon filled with fish. Was it a miracle? No, it was a very remarkable occurrence, a supernormal happening. Jesus seems to have known that if Peter fished in deep water, he would have a good haul, in spite of the glare on the lake. How was that? It must have been a miracle, says the Orthodox believer. Jesus was God and could do everything and knew everything. Higher criticism, on the other hand, scorns so metaphysical and unscientific a suggestion and rejects the incident. The highest criticism, however, which always takes into consideration the findings of physical science, is in no hurry to reject the story of the drought of fishes. It admits that the incident may not have taken place, and it could never accept the story as historically accurate on the ground that it is in the Bible. But it is so familiar with the wonders of psychic science that it cannot be hurried into rejecting the story. To begin with, it knows of 2 or 3 psychic laws which might well account for the drought of fishes. The clairvoyant powers of Jesus could have enabled him to see just where a shoal of fishes had gathered. That being so, he could have told Peter exactly when and where to lower the nets. He may have heard clairaudiently the when and the where. The fish may have been apports. We are hearing today from more than one reliable source that certain wise men of the East can, at will, materialize objects at a distance. Jesus may have exercised this power and materialized objects, fish, in deep waters. He may have performed this sign and wonder by psychic means at present unknown to us. The psychic scientist knows all this and has escaped from the rut and routine of orthodox science. His psychic experiences have so widened his knowledge and increased his range of thought and vision that he thinks in terms which are vastly different from those of the orthodox. The difference is as great as that between the modern man who thinks in terms of electricity, radium, X-rays, wireless, airplanes, submarines, etc., and the man of a past age who was ignorant of these things. Nothing is easier than to dismiss the story of the drought of fishes as an exaggeration made at a time when Jesus was being deified by his followers. But to the psychic scientist, nothing is easier than to foresee a time when such a dismissal will be deemed amateurish. Consider for a moment some of the things we know today. Professor Anthony tells us that every substance, chemical and gas, has a wavelength of its own and can be transmitted on this wavelength. The transmission can be controlled almost as accurately as a big gun. In a recent mimic airwave over London, he says 6 bombers were to take off on a raid when a certain signal was received. When the signal was given, we were warned at the same time. He and his assistants and apparatus were at a house about 3 miles away, and we sent out transmissions on the wavelength of hydrogen and oxygen, the 2 gases that compose water. Not one of the machines was able to take off, and when the fuel in the tanks was tested, it was found to have been spoilt with water. Quoted from The People, August 8, 1937. The transmission of two wavelengths of two gases directed to their objective changed them into a liquid when they reached it. And has not every thought a wavelength? We have already discovered that thought is dynamic. It is force and motion. The chief difference between wireless and telepathy is that one is mechanical and the other is not. In telepathy, the communicating parties prepare themselves to broadcast and to receive, tune in, impressions made by the force of thought vibration. When we think this out, we begin to realize its stupendous implications. Then again, the psychic scientist is familiar with the materialization and dematerialization of things and persons. Sir Ernest Wallace Budge, one of the greatest authorities on Egyptian antiquities, tells us that he has seen men vanish into air while speaking to them. He has stood on the spot where they vanished and has been pushed aside from it as they rematerialized. Sir William Crookes told me personally that when he was testing the psychic powers of Florrie Cook, a discarnate spirit who called herself Katie, fully materialized. On 3 occasions, he handled simultaneously both Florrie Cook and Katie. He took the pulse of each, and they greatly differed. He examined the body of each, and they greatly differed. He told me that one day Katie expressed the wish to see one of his children, a baby 3 weeks old, and that he went upstairs and fetched the little boy. Katie held the baby in her arms for a few moments, and then returned him. Katie was plumper and heavier than Miss Cook, and yet there are those who ask us to believe that Miss Cook must have swallowed Katie before the sitting and regurgitating her at the sitting. The belief of unbelief is unbelievable. Well, these are just a few of the things that the psychic scientists know. And when they are faced with such a subject as the drought of fishes, they do not turn away from it in mild amusement. They bring all their knowledge of clairvoyance, clairaudience, apports, materialization, etc., to bear upon it. They do not insist that it occurred, but they do insist that there is no reason in the nature of things why it could not have occurred. We now come to the first occasion when Jesus gave offense to the priests and the Pharisees. At one of the weekday services in the synagogue, the congregation filled every available space, and no one else could get in at the door. Jesus was preaching to them, and a paralyzed man was brought by his friends for him to heal. He was a young man who believed wholeheartedly that Jesus could heal him. So eager was he to get to Jesus that he asked his friends to carry him to the roof of the building and let him down just in front of Jesus. This they did. The greater healer saw at once what it meant, and he was very careful in the way he dealt with the situation. His psychic faculty revealed to him that the young man's illness was due to sin, and that he had repented. He therefore said to him, "Man, thy sins have been forgiven thee," a perfectly natural announcement to make. It was the Jewish view that all illness is the result of sin, and no healing can come unless sins are forgiven. Now, had Jesus healed the man without referring to his sins, the Jews would have regarded such action as evil. So, before healing the man, he announced that his sins had been forgiven. But the priests and Pharisees, having no idea how Jesus knew this, called him a blasphemer. "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" they said. To this Jesus answered, which is the easier thing to say, "Thy sins have been forgiven," or to say, "Rise and walk." He then turned to the men and said, "Arise, pick up your mattress, and go to your home." From that moment, the Pharisees were lynx-eyed to find fault with him, and they dogged his footsteps. Well now, was this paralyzed man healed in a miraculous way? No. There are no miraculous ways. There are only laws, physical, mental, psychical and spiritual. But did not God heal the man? Yes, but God acts through his own laws, and his great object is to bring man into conformity with those laws. I understand that by the exercise of faith, paralysis has been cured instantaneously at Lourdes, but the muscular atrophy has taken some days to disappear. And we have all read of remarkable and almost instantaneous cures of paralysis by one means or another. In the case of the man who was brought to Jesus, we have A. the man's faith that Jesus could heal him, B. the faith of his friends, C. the magnetic force, virtue, or power which came out of Jesus. Any one of these could have healed the man. The healing may have been due to a combination of all three, but in any case, the healing was natural, not miraculous. End of chapter. Stay right here. I'm going to go ahead and move on to chapter 7. Jesus dared to heal on the Sabbath. The greatest offense in the eyes of rabbinism was Sabbath breaking, and Jesus knew it. I must dwell on this because it gives the true background to the healing of the man with the withered hand in the sacred synagogue on the sacred day. The scribes and lawyers had turned a day of rest into a day of fear. There was a terrible list of things forbidden to be done on the Sabbath. There were 39 works which might not be done, and the casuists of the law had so interpreted them that there was hardly anything one might do. For instance, reaping was forbidden, threshing and winnowing. But these casuists said that to pluck ears of corn was reaping, to rub them in the hands was threshing, and to blow away the husk was winnowing. All labor was forbidden, even such a labor of love as healing. Well, one Sabbath day, the disciples of Jesus, when passing through a cornfield, plucked some ears of corn and rubbed them in their hands. The Pharisees saw them and at once rebuked Jesus for allowing such a thing. They said, "Why are you disciples doing what is not allowed on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered, "They are not. They're only doing what you say is forbidden, and your Sabbath notions are utterly wrong. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." On the next Sabbath, the Pharisee laid a trap for him. Jesus went into the synagogue and taught, and there was present a man whose right hand was withered. The scribes and Pharisees were there too, and they watched to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. Jesus was determined to heal the man, to defy scribe and Pharisee, and to break their caricature of the Sabbath. But he knew that to heal would be no easy matter owing to the destructive hate vibrations which his opponents were sending out. He knew, too, that the man would certainly not expect to be healed on the Sabbath. He was therefore faced with two kinds of difficulties. A, the hate vibrations and unbelief. B, the unpreparedness and absence of an expectant faith on the part of the diseased man. So Jesus set to work to try and win his opponents to a saner view of the Sabbath in the hope that what he said would convince the diseased man and beget within him a living, healing faith. This was the preparatory process adopted by him. The man was seated, and Jesus asked him to rise and stand before them. Then, looking around on them with anger, he said to these bigoted Sabbatarians, "I ask you, is it right to help or to hurt on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? What man of you, if we have a sheep fall into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lift him out? Is not a man of more value than a sheep?" They dared not answer. Jesus had won. He had not won them. They hated him the more. But he had won the response and trust of the diseased man, whose faith was thus raised to such a pitch as to release the healing forces within him. Jesus saw this and said to him, "Stretch out your hand," and it was restored whole as the other. This was not a miracle. Jesus was not omnipotent. He could only heal under certain conditions. His power was nullified by the presence of unbelief and greatly curtailed by doubt. Faith was a prime necessity. Where faith was weak, Jesus did all he could to strengthen it. His healing was never arbitrary. It was the result of the cooperation of his will and power with the will and faith of the patient. Had Jesus been a mere wonder worker, he would have exercised his powers for his own self-glorification and said nothing about the faith of the recipients. He did the reverse. He never laid stress on his own share in the healing. He laid stress on the healing power inherent in every man. This power he called faith. As is thy faith, so be it unto you. It is impossible to overestimate the power of faith. I once asked a famous physiologist whether he thought it possible that faith might cure all manner of diseases. He answered, "Yes, I think it quite possible, because faith can so affect certain glands as to cause, sometimes immediately, a revivifying, revitalizing, healing effect upon every part of the body." Jesus came to reveal man to man. He himself was a superman, but not a supernatural man. The powers that were so fully developed in him are latent in us all. He came to tell us so. Jesus had been ministering in Galilee about a year when the feast of the Passover called him to Jerusalem. In that city there was a pool having 5 porches. The Crusaders knew of its existence and built a church over it with a crypt after the pattern of the 5 porches. It has recently been identified by agents of the Palestine Exploration Society. The pool was fed with water from the hills, and gushes of chalybeate water would ever now and then come into it, causing it to bubble and hiss. This was called the moving of the water. The water then became marvelously red, says Eusebius, owing to the iron in it, and the sick were healed by bathing in the pool. Jesus turned naturally to this house of mercy, Bethesda, as the pool was called. His heart was ever with the sick and suffering, and on the first Sabbath day that he was in Jerusalem, he went among his suffering brethren. A poor paralyzed man especially filled him with pity. For 38 years the sufferer had been coming to the pool, day after day, in the hope that he might manage to get into the pool when the chalybeate water rushed in. But he had no one to help him, and had lost hope. The story makes it clear that, though he had lost hope, he had not lost faith. Indeed, he had 38 years of faith stored up within him. Jesus knew this, and he saw at once that what was required was that the man should regain hope, which would release the power of his pent-up faith. Common sense would now have us read between the lines of this story. Jesus was set upon restoring hope to the man. It was said of Jesus, "Never man so spake." And would it not be perfectly natural to assume that in one so full of love and compassion as Jesus, never man so looked? The expression in his eyes must have sent a thrill of hope deep down into the man's soul. Jesus was the kind of man who spoke his message through his eyes before he spoke it in words. And his look would have convinced the paralytic that here at last was a real friend, one who would help him into the pool and would not fail him. And so, with hope restored, the pent-up faith of 38 years would flood the man's being. Jesus saw this and said, "Do you want to be healed?" Here again, we may be sure that the tone and manner in which those few words were uttered would have vitally increased the man's hope and faith. We cannot overestimate the therapeutic power of a look, a tone, and a manner. How often do we say, "It was not what was said, it was the way in which it was said"? And I judge the way in which Jesus spoke to his sick friend to have been helpful far beyond all words. I noticed that when Peter was about to heal a lame man, he fastened his eyes upon him. Jesus had evidently instructed Peter in the power of the eyes in the art of healing. And I picture the master healer fastening his eyes on the paralytic and saying, "Arise, take up thy body and walk." And the man was made whole. After 38 years. How anxious everyone must have been to see and know the man who had made possible this glorious healing after so many years of misery. No, it was not so. Jesus had once again broken the Sabbath law of the scribes and Pharisees, and these casuists hated him the more. They were orthodox. They loved the Sabbath rules more than they loved human beings. Their mechanized religion had crushed the life out of spiritual religion. Orthodoxy was to them the only passport. Those who were unorthodox were outside the sphere of conventional grace. Their good deeds were evil. Their healing was illegal. If they cast out devils, they did it by the power of the prince of devils. The Orthodox Church of today does not use this language, but by its acts, the language is implied. At least one bishop will have nothing to do with those who dare to exercise the gift of healing outside the sphere of covenanted grace, the church. Indeed, he is more than suspicious of those who exercise that gift within the church. Healing services held in churches in his diocese are, he says, held without his permission and against his wishes. As it was in the beginning is now, but shall it ever be? No. The dawn of a new age is already here. Orthodoxy, not Jesus, is being despised and rejected of men. End of chapter. Head over to the next video where I will continue with the reading of The Psychic Life of Jesus.